Welcome to another edition of George Washington Speaks. I'm Tom Saffold. During the 4 years since the British imposed the Declaratory Act, it appeared that things had quieted down, but they had not. In Boston, 1 out of every 5 individuals was a redcoat. Resentments against them continued to deepen. Confrontations and fights between the soldiers and colonists escalated until violence could not be contained. The events of a single defining event, the Boston Massacre, are described in the Boston Massacre edition of George Washington Speaks.
Today I'd like to talk about the Boston Massacre. The exact sequence of the events of the Boston Massacre is not known for certain, since the situation was greatly affected by heightened emotions and strong prejudices. The evidence given by multiple eyewitnesses was wildly contradictory, and much of the testimony proved to be untrustworthy. However, due to the ensuing trial, the court records, and the eventual outcome, we can, for the most part, reconstruct the events. What we know is this: that on the evening of March 5th, 1770, British Private Hugh White stood watching the Custom House on King Street. Boston had just emerged from a cold spell, and the roads were blanketed with as much as 1 foot of snow and frozen ice. While Private White was in his sentry box, he observed a group of British soldiers and Boston townsmen crossing paths on the street in front of him. Abusive language and loud accusations of wrongdoing were exchanged between the two groups, and Private White came to the defense of the British soldiers. He verbally defended them and possibly hit one of the colonists, a 13-year-old Edward Garrick, a wig maker's apprentice, on the head with the butt of his musket. Several bystanders rushed to the aid of Garrick, while others verbally taunted Private White, and still others threw snowballs at him. The private moved and took a somewhat safer position on the steps of the Custom House, and then, due to the increasing hostility of the crowd, he loaded his weapon for protection. At some point, church bells began to sound in the distance, and men began pouring out onto the streets in response to the alarm that normally signaled a fire. Most dispersed, but some of them joined the other colonists in front of the Custom House. As a result, Private White's anxiety increased, and when he saw no means of escape, he began shouting for other soldiers to come to his aid. Several concerned local residents ran to alert British Captain Thomas Preston of Private White's dangerous predicament. Although the captain was initially reticent to send troops into the fray, he feared for the private's safety and that of the security of the Custom House. He soon led 7 soldiers through the crowd to the private's aid. Upon reaching White, the soldiers formed a semicircle in front of the soldier and used their bayonets to keep the townsmen at bay. By that time, the crowd had swelled to between 300 and 400 people and was considered by the captain to be an unruly and hostile mob. Captain Preston shouted orders at the crowd to disperse and return to their homes, but they only responded with jeers and a barrage of more snowballs. Some of the mob even taunted the soldiers by shouting, "Why do you not fire?" and "Damn you, you dare not fire," and "Fire and be damned." Testimony from others indicated that while some were taunting the soldiers, other colonists were either pleading with the soldiers not to shoot or trying to calm them down. Then a local rope maker named Richard Palms is said to have stepped out in front of the rabble brandishing a wooden stick. He shouted at Captain Preston, "Are your soldiers' guns loaded?" to which the captain answered that they were in fact loaded. Palms responded, "I hope you don't intend that the soldiers shall fire on the inhabitants." Preston replied, "By no means," and he pointed out that he was standing in front of his men. Then, only moments later, someone hurled a wooden club from the crowd, which struck Private Montgomery. The private fell down and dropped his musket, and then struggled to get to his feet and raised his weapon. With that, the violence began to escalate, and the crowd started aggressively to strike out at the soldiers with their clubs and sticks. Consistent testimony from most indicated that it was then that someone yelled the word "fire," and a gun was fired.
The Boston Massacre created even stronger divisions between colonists loyal to Britain and King George, called Loyalists, and those who began calling for freedom from British rule, called Patriots. The legal charges following the Boston Massacre had to be answered in court, and that's the subject of the next edition of George Washington Speaks.